introduce to each other. You may notice that I'm not Christine. She was attacked by a dog last week, so she sends her apologies. Apparently, when the students will go to Australia later on, you got to be careful because in the beaches, apparently, there are some wild dogs. But anyways, she sends her apologies, and I will do my best to cover. My job is very similar to what my predecessors did earlier on in the day. So the main goal is to make sure that we are on time. And the other main goal is to make sure that we have a discussion going. So this is the last session of the day. We are fortunate to have two very important speakers. Gary Edwards is an old friend of ours. He has been in the advisory board for SXT ever since we started working on it. He comes from the Environment Agency and is going to give us an overview of the permit process for shale gas operations in the UK. And the second speaker will be Jenny from Northeastern University in Boston. She's been so dedicated to being present today that she flew in this morning. So we're very grateful for that. She's in the social aspects, she's becoming a superstar, and we're very fortunate to have you here. And we'll see what your recommendations will be. And I hope that your comments will be provocative so that we can stimulate more discussions, especially with our students. So, Gary?
Thank you, Alberto. Okay, so today I'm going to give you a very quick overview of our role and how we work our way through the regulatory landscape, the tools we use, how we work with other regulators, the special challenges that hydraulic fracturing puts on us and our permitting process, including things like standard rules, permits, and I'll introduce you to a new regulatory tool, the hydraulic fracturing plans. And finally, I'll come on to say a little bit about the evidence that we require operators to provide us in terms of demonstrating their compliance with the permit conditions, particularly in the subsurface environment where it's very difficult to collect data directly. I'll finish up with a bit about the work we've been doing on public engagement and also introduce you to the Shale Environmental Regulator. So, quickly moving on. We cover, our role covers a very wide range of industrial sectors, including some big industries such as the power sector, refineries and large-scale wastewater treatment. So we have a lot of experience in these areas, and what we've tried to do is take our experience and learning from that and apply that as consistently as we can to the onshore oil and gas industry. Our approach to regulation, we are a risk-based, evidence-led organisation, which means that we try to be pragmatic and fair in our regulation and also allow our customers the opportunity to demonstrate that they have appropriate mitigations in place for what they are planning to do. We carry out inspections and audits of sites to ensure that operators are complying with their permits. And in terms of monitoring, we often get criticised for allowing operators to, or it's part of the process whereby operators do their own self-monitoring. But it's actually a very rigorous process because we do carry out our own checks as well as spot checks on the quality of the monitoring work that operators are doing. So it is fully controlled. It just means that the operator has the burden of carrying out the majority of the on-site monitoring. We also provide an awful lot of advice and guidance, which is of great benefit to the public and the industry. And I've deliberately put enforcement at the end there because if all of those processes beforehand are working properly, we should very rarely actually have to get to the point where we carry out hardline enforcement. But it is there and we do use it when we need to. So before I go through this slide, I'll just say that we do work very closely with the other regulators, such as the HSE, the Health and Safety Executive, and the OGA, the Oil and Gas Authority. But this is a timeline, so it gives you an idea of the route that operators go through in England to get their activity underway. So they will have to start with a petroleum exploration development licence, which is the role of the OGA, and also to agree with the landowner access to the property. And before they can carry out any geophysical surveys, they need both of those authorisations in place. So therefore, they tend to be at the front. Moving on from that is our environmental permit. And we have a huge number of aspects that we look at for the environmental side of things, and I'll run through those later. And then moving on from that, but it's often dual-tracked because of the amount of time that it takes, is the planning permission from the local authority. After planning, there is the Health and Safety Executive look at specialist technical aspects, things like well design. That's quite quick, so that can be done nearer to the time that the company planned to drill, but it has to be carried out before they drill. And then finally, the OGA come back into the scene again, looking at the particular risks from seismic activity. So all in all, there is a clear pathway that has to be followed. Now, for all of the activities that could potentially have an environmental impact, we review the permit application to ensure that all the proposals that are being put forward by the operator meet something called Best Available Technique, or BAT for short. And this is really, really important because we want operators to achieve the highest relevant standards. These have to be standards that are commonly available to the industry. They're not things that are just simply under development or blue sky thinking, although we do like to support development, and that's why I've been involved with the ShaleXT program. But there is a clear difference between what we might call shoddy process and best practice, which is, as I say, what we expect all operators in England to come up to. So here in this slide, for example, open pits for storing the drilling muds and everything is not acceptable. The drilling muds have to be managed properly, and the drill cuttings have to be stored in proper sealed tanks. So looking at risks from poor well design, most things that go on with wells are a notifiable activity to the Health and Safety Executive and are not our responsibility. But there are three main areas where wells are of concern to us. That is where there is a requirement for best available techniques under either the EPR 2016 regs or the Industrial Emissions Directive. The next circumstance is where there is a clear and credible source pathway receptor linkage, which we saw in some of the slides earlier this morning, to an environmental receptor, that the environment could be harmed. And the third area where we have a concern with wells and an interest is what I call the in perpetuity requirement, because a lot of the work that other regulators do stops at the point of closure, at decommissioning, whereas we have a responsibility to represent the public in terms of environmental protection in perpetuity. So we go well beyond that. We go well into the post-closure period, and we have to be satisfied that a well is safe and not posing a risk to the environment after that closure. Risks from hydraulic fracturing are very specific. We saw some much better slides from Alberto this morning. much better than I've got here, so I won't go through these again, but they all involve some form of mobilisation of solutes or methane out of the shales and into areas where we wouldn't want them to go, such as groundwater. I draw your attention to the Infrastructure Act 2015. This changed the regulatory environment considerably for shale gas in particular, in that Section 6, Article 50 of the Infrastructure Act introduced 11 specific requirements that now have to be met by operators. And they then apply to the Secretary of State in order to get their frac consent. In other words, to demonstrate that they have met the requirements of the Infrastructure Act. The definition of associated hydraulic fracturing, as you can see on the slide here, is really quite specific. That's been a bit controversial. Obviously, it always is when you have a specific number, because somebody can come in just slightly under, somebody else comes in slightly over. You know, is there really much of a difference between that? Well, there is, from a legal point of view. This is the official definition of hydraulic fracturing. But I'll say a little bit more later about hydraulic fracturing plans, and we do expect more evidence, even if operators come in below these specific figures here, but they are carrying out hydraulic fracturing. We still require evidence that they are going to comply with their permit conditions. So the hydraulic fracturing consent that I mentioned a moment ago, 4 of those 11 requirements that are set out in Article 50 fall to the Environment Agency, including no fracturing in groundwater source protection zone 1s. And just to remind you that they are determined through groundwater modelling, 50-day travel time, to the well, to, for example, a public water abstraction borehole, or if it can't be modelled, it's 50 metres. So they are quite close to either public water extractions or extractions for public consumption. So, for example, if a brewery or a food manufacturer has got a borehole, then that counts as public consumption as well. Groundwater methane monitoring has to be carried out for 12 months before hydraulic fracturing can commence, so that there's background data on that, and also monitoring of methane to air. And those results have to be published so that the public can see that this is being done and what the results are. And the chemicals have to be approved by the environmental regulator, by ourselves, so that we are not inadvertently permitting the use of hazardous substances in frac fluids. And that assessment as to what is a hazardous substance is carried out through under the auspices of the JAGDAG process. That's the Joint Agencies Groundwater Directive Advisory Group. They set the rules on that assessment. So we make sure that all of those 4 elements are complied with. Slightly different requirements for carrying out hydraulic fracturing in protected areas. There's a list of the protected areas, and in those situations there are more specific requirements, including a depth limitation of a minimum depth of 1,200 metres below surface, whereas it's 1,000 metres elsewhere. Permitting process itself is fairly straightforward to understand. An application is made. Duly made means that we just look at it and make sure that it looks like a bona fide application that the operator has put in. It's followed by 20 working day public consultation and a technical assessment by our permitting specialists. We consider the representations from the public consultation, and then we come to a determination and a decision, and then we announce that final decision. Slightly different for sites of high public interest. The first 3 stages of that are the same, but then we have a determination and draft decision consultation of 20 working days, and consider the final representations before we announce the final decision. The definition of sites of high public interest is a bit of a circular argument because it basically means any sites for which there is a high public concern or interest, which includes most hydraulic fracturing proposals at the moment. So permitting considerations, we have to consider quite a lot in our appraisal of the permit application. So we look at what they are doing for all extractive waste. That would be everything from drill cuttings, drilling muds if they're waste, through to spent fluids and including any waste gas that is produced. So there's a big range of materials which fall under that category. The waste management plan is a vital part of the permit for mining waste, for extractive waste. And the considerations we have for that initially is that operators have to characterise their waste. If they can't characterise the waste properly, then they can't identify the risks. So that is absolutely essential. We then go through what's called the waste hierarchy, which puts a responsibility on the operator to demonstrate that they have followed the process of reduce, reuse, recycle, and only then do they consider disposal of that waste. As I've said before, they have to disclose all chemicals that they are using, so we are aware if this might be hazardous. And finally, the waste management plan has to include plans for final closure of the site and the monitoring that is carried out. We look at, in terms of groundwater, we look at groundwater monitoring, the groundwater activities that are carried out, and if there are any implications for groundwater either from the surface effects or from the underground, and this includes a very detailed risk assessment. The Section 199 notice or intention to drill primarily, although it is concerned with the well, it's primarily concerned with those aspects of the well which could have an impact on near-surface groundwater. So we're looking at the design primarily of the conductor casing and the surface casing, and those activities at the surface, such as storage of chemicals and drilling fluids that could leak into groundwater. Flaring of waste gas. If it's less than 10 tonnes a day, it falls under the Mining Waste Directive. If it's greater than 10 tonnes per day, it comes under the Industrial Emissions Directive. So that's a slight complication there. And radioactive substances regulations mean that if any of the wastes that are produced exceed the out-of-scope values for norm, that's naturally occurring radioactive materials, then they have to be treated as radioactive. I mentioned earlier about standard rules permits. We have literally thousands of standard rules permits across hundreds of sectors. They are in no way substandard to a bespoke permit. They are equally as robust from a regulatory point of view. It's just that they are designed to cover activities where the risks are very well known and understood, and therefore we can offer a much more streamlined permitting approach for those activities. Examples would be drilling, coring and collection of downhole data through wireline collection methods, wireline logging. And we have a generic risk assessment for them, and we can issue those permits very quickly. Under no circumstances does it authorise any hydraulic fracturing activities, but if, for example, an operator wishes to get on and drill a well to see if it's worth then going any further and applying for the full consents, they can do that under a standard rules. So there are additional requirements for information around hydraulic fracturing, and this is where we have starting to have more overlap between the regulators, ourselves, the HSE and the OGA. We ourselves are interested in particularly in the risk to groundwater, for the groundwater activity, and also to make sure that any hydraulic fracturing fluids that are left in the ground at the end of the period of operation, when they become waste, are retained within the permit boundary so that we actually know where they are and can be clear that they're not going to pose a risk to the environment. But we do work very closely with the OGA and the HSE to make sure that all of the information is collected and is agreeable to all of the regulators. So in terms of the hydraulic fracturing plan, we are interested in making sure that all of the additional information comes in. There's a lot of information that is required that is not available at the time of permit determination for certain technical reasons, such as they need to drill the well first. And for those reasons, we give the operator the opportunity to then present that after they've got their initial permit, but before they carry out fracturing in the hydraulic fracturing plan, the HFP for short. This slide just highlights some of the generic risks from hydraulic fracturing operations, many of which we've looked at and discussed earlier, and as I say, it mostly comes down to the mobilisation into different strata, either by fracking outside of the target shales into a groundwater bearing horizon above it, or through high conductivity pathways, fault reactivation, or damage to the well. In all those situations, the operation has been deemed not to have gone to plan. It will be contradictory to what will be in their approved hydraulic fracturing plan, and this is the sort of information that we want. So this is where there is then a very strong requirement to gather evidence on what's going on underground so that the operator can clearly demonstrate compliance with their permit. This just shows you some of the data blocks and where they come in. Some things such as BGS maps and the basic information are available at the very time of permit application when the operator's pulling that together. And then other information is gathered and presented in the middle when they're writing their hydraulic fracturing plan. And then further data is those that are shown in the red blocks on this side, may only be available when they actually start to carry out hydraulic fracturing. And then we would expect that to be used iteratively in future frac stages. So lessons learned from the first frac stage in a given well would be incorporated into improved methodologies for subsequent frac stages. Gathering information is key, as you'll have gathered from this. This slide shows you the BGS broadband seismometer network across the UK. This is the global earthquake monitoring network. The what colour are they? The green ones on there. And those are that's a permanent network. There are others, the UK network, and they're shown in that pinky colour, pinky reddy colour. They are technically temporary because we don't know that the funding for those is going to carry on forever, but I would describe them as long-term temporary. There's certainly no immediate plan to withdraw them, and you'll notice that they are currently positioned in the north of England across the areas where most of the fracturing is likely to be carried out. The data that's highlighted in red on that list on the right-hand side is data that can be submitted in the hydraulic fracturing plan. And the benefit of this is that although the sensitivity of the broadband seismometers is not as good as that of geophones, they're always working, and the data that comes from these is highly trusted, and it goes onto the BGS website pretty much in real time, and it is available in the public domain via the internet. So there's a very high level of public confidence in these data. As well as the permanent networks, there is a need for near-surface recording from seismometers when fracturing is being carried out, and these are installed. They generally require a power source. They have to be installed by experienced technicians, and the purpose of them, although they can be susceptible to surface noise such as traffic and other activities, they do give a good triangulation on where events are occurring. They also help to give a very good background data set on the types of noise. For example, if the site is near a motorway, there will be peaks during the day of when there is a lot of traffic-induced seismic noise within the upper layers of the Earth's crust. And then, as well as that surface network, there is the downhole geophone arrays. These are quite long pieces of kit because they're stacked geophones, they're stacked arrays. They record data in the X, Y, Z directions, and they are particularly sensitive. And these are installed downhole. You can see ringed in yellow the little clamps, and when they're installed in the well, those clamps come out and they actually trap the geophone against the wall of the well. And we do require the operator to carry out trial shots to make sure that they're working properly before they carry out fracturing. These are absolutely essential to getting the detail that we need to support things like the traffic light system, to make sure that operators are not exceeding the set limits in the permits and the requirements of the OGA while they're carrying out fracturing. On the right-hand side, there is a diagram from the Kirby Misperton well in the Vale of Pickering, and that was the modelling for the sensitivity of the installed geophone there. And as you can see, at the lowest point, which was frac stage E for that well, and I stress this hasn't been carried out yet, they're still waiting to get permission to go ahead, the sensitivity is still -2 on the log scale for magnitude there, which is well within the sensitivity that we need for proof that that's going okay. I don't want to say a lot about the traffic light system. We've already seen some information on that today, other than to say that it's widely used across the world, in the US, Canada in particular, using it, and the OGA are very happy with this as a regulatory tool, so that operators know where they are in terms of stopping, checking what's going on, making sure that everything's okay, and then going forward when they've got a green again. And the actual layout of this flowchart will be site-dependent, will be developed between the operator and the regulator for each particular site to make sure that it's fit for purpose. When we get a hydraulic fracturing plan sent in to us, and bear in mind that it is examined by all of the regulators, we put together an assessment panel of the relevant technical specialists to look at this and make their comments. We review it, we send those comments back to the operator, and that is an iterative process until we are satisfied that all of the relevant questions and all of the necessary background data have been provided. And once we're satisfied with that, and only when we're satisfied with it, and all the regulators are happy, then does that HFP get approval. So you'll see there that as well as our own internal staff, there are inputs from other organisations, including other regulators from other parts of the world who've been kind and very generous with their time to help us through this rather difficult process. So on to public engagement. There really does remain a very high degree of public interest in this industry. We had 36,000 responses to a consultation on standard rules, a new standard rules permit, and that was in just one weekend. We had over 100,000 responses to a consultation on one application for a new well. We have an average of 200 freedom of information requests coming to us every year. We take public engagement very seriously, and we work with all of the other regulators, including Public Health England, to organise and attend public engagement events. And the feedback that we've had from that has been very, very good on the whole. We're very committed to public engagement, and we feel that it's only right and proper that we demonstrate what we are doing, what we are doing to make sure that the industry is performing well. This is my last slide. I'd like to finish up by telling you about the Shale Environmental Regulator. This is a new initiative It's only planned for 1 year at the moment, and then the government will review it. And what it does is, and it only applies to shale, but the purpose of it is to bring all of the regulators together under one banner, effectively. There will be coordinators who will speak for the SER. It is the steering group is director-led, and they will be carrying out a review to check that it does have a beneficial impact on industry through efficiencies. And we will appoint coordinators. And those coordinators are going to be employed by the Environment Agency, and they will speak as one voice for all of the regulators. So this is a fantastic opportunity to demonstrate to everybody that we are working as all the regulators working in a very joined-up way. A new working together agreement was signed off in September, which builds on the old one that we have, and I have every confidence that we will be able to deliver robust regulation with greater efficiencies for industry going forward, and that we will be able to deliver a truly world-class level of regulation for the onshore oil and gas industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary, for an informative and very clear presentation. I will invite Jenny, and then we will have questions for both our speakers. So Professor Jenny Stephens is the director of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs.
Yes.
Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for staying through the day. I have the honor or privilege to kind of zoom out and give a bigger picture perspective about energy and energy systems and public acceptability about energy infrastructure. So I am currently a professor of sustainability science and policy. As was mentioned, I'm in the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs. I have a joint appointment also in civil and environmental engineering. And I have a very interdisciplinary background. My PhD and my master's were in environmental science and engineering. But since I finished my PhD, I've been more interested in the social and political dimensions of energy and climate change, and energy technology innovation in particular. So that's how I am doing what I'm doing right now. So what I wanted to just point out is when we talk about public acceptability, there are many different publics and diversity in the publics and what the public is worried about, interested in, and concerned about. I also want to point out energy systems is the way I think about all energy innovation with this kind of systems perspective, and I really embrace a social, technical systems perspective, so you can't really understand the technology without also understanding the social, and the social dynamics influence also which technologies we actually pay attention to and deploy. So I think of socio-technical systems in the way I think about all of these technological innovations. So I appreciate being invited and to integrate some social science into this discussion today. There's been, in the past, I'd say 5 years or so, a big uptake in social science about energy. And so it's a growing field, and there's a lot to study. So those of you who have technical backgrounds, if you're interested in getting involved in social science related to energy, I encourage you to explore it. There's this paper from 2014 just pointed out that there's an under-evaluation of the social dimensions of energy in energy research. There's also under-representation of women and minorities studying energy, and minimal integration of social sciences. And scientists and engineers, when they collaborate in kind of narrow ways, according to this review. And there's a lot of opportunities for integrating more social science into all energy research projects. So I teach a course called Energy System Transformation, and this is the course map for my class. And I know it's pretty busy, but I just want to walk you through it to give kind of this broad perspective. The way I think about things is that we have a legacy system of fossil fuel-based energy systems, and that's where we still dominant in many of our communities and societies and regions of the world. And we are moving toward a renewable-based energy systems. And this transformation, I think, is inevitable. It's going to happen. And obviously, we still are very reliant on fossil fuels. And but when we study this transformation, we can explore the technological innovation, that's this top arrow, and then we can also explore the social innovation, because again, if you're thinking about this from a systems perspective, the social and the technological are intricately linked. The course that I teach explores both technologies of fossil fuel technologies and technological innovations in renewables. And then we also study the social dimensions of fossil fuel infrastructure and policies that are encouraging and supporting fossil fuels, and the other considerations with climate change and policies that are encouraging the renewable transformation. So as I said, from my perspective, this transformation is happening. No matter what anyone does, this is going to happen. It's happening in different places, different pace in different parts of the world. Germany is the country in the world that has made a national policy to move away from both fossil fuels and nuclear. But this is happening. We don't know exactly the time frame, but ultimately we will be moving toward much more renewable-based technology. This is not a simple technological substitution. There's a lot of social change associated with it too, and that's actually what I want to be provocative and share some of the social change that is possible as we make this shift toward more renewable-based. And I know it sounds a little bit off topic, but hopefully it'll be helpful to situate the context for this project that is focused on shale gas. So one of the things to consider with this energy transformation, it is disruptive, right? Because human beings, we want things to be the same, we like stability, and when there's a big shift, there's resistance. And we can see resistance for this transformation particularly among those in the world that are profiting a lot from fossil fuel infrastructure. But when there's this big disruptive transformation, it's also an opportunity for economic and political change. And what I'm going to suggest is that we can actually solve some problems of social justice and inequalities in society through this transformation toward renewable energy. I think people don't pay enough attention to this point that this transformation is a shift from a fierce competition for scarce resources. That's what fossil fuels are. There's a limited amount, and we compete for them, to abundant and plentiful source of energy. Once you can harness the sun, the wind, the tide, geothermal, it's perpetual. It'll never end, right? It'll keep coming. So this is a fundamental shift, and if we can kind of move toward that, and when we move toward that, we'll be in a very different place economically and politically, as well as with regard to the environment. And finally, I would suggest on a larger time frame than any of us are really able to measure the costs, that resisting this transformation, the costs of not accelerating the transformation toward renewables, is actually greater than the costs of doing the transformation. So that sounds maybe a little bit complicated, but increasingly we are seeing the evidence of all the negative social costs of our fossil fuel infrastructure. And with climate change adding to that, we are increasingly becoming more and more vulnerable, and we're having all kinds of additional costs that don't get integrated into our decision making right now, but they are societal costs. The other point I just want to make about this arrow, I mentioned this transformation is happening. I think it's an inevitable transformation that's underway. We sometimes might look like we're going backwards. It's not necessarily a simple linear process. And in the United States right now, we have a federal government that is accelerating fossil fuel extraction and minimizing renewables. So I think we're in the United States going in this direction right now. But when one country goes in that direction, it doesn't mean this transformation isn't happening. The United States is losing its leadership potential, but this transformation is a global transformation, and it's happening. So one of the questions that I think this audience is really welcome to grapple with is, in this transformation, what is the role of these bridge fuels, right? Natural gas is sometimes called a bridge fuel. It's cleaner than coal, but it's not renewable, right? And it's still a fossil fuel. It's still contributing to climate change. And we can ask ourselves during this time, during the transition, how do we want to prioritize our investments? And we can make investments as a society that can accelerate this transformation, or we can make investments in infrastructure and technology that can slow down this transformation. And so many people argue that a lot of fossil fuel investments that are being made right now are actually slowing down the transformation and are not in the interest of the public good. So in the United States, right now, this is showing the past 30 years. Coal is here, and the orange is the natural gas. So this is what we can see, this natural gas boom in the past 10 years is overtaken coal. So this replacement of coal, gas with coal. Here's renewables, so you can see that is accelerating, and the price of solar is increasingly plummeting. We're finally in the United States about to do a whole lot of offshore wind, so renewables are really accelerating more than most people recognize and are aware of. So the US fracking explosion, this is just showing the scale and scope. I think it's 21 of the 50 United States have fracking, and there are several states that have banned fracking. New York, Maryland, and Vermont and Massachusetts have also banned fracking. So it's very controversial. And there's minimal regulation. One of the problems in the United States is that the federal level has not provided much regulation at all, so it's up to the states to provide the regulation. And a lot of the states want to have the fracking because they get kickbacks from the companies. And so financial benefit, short-term financial benefit. So there's some very minimal regulation. So we just heard about the regulation here. And I don't know a direct comparison, but my sense from the work that I've done and what I've been involved with is that the regulation in the United States is not very good. And as you may have heard, our current government is trying to gut all environmental regulations across the board, including fossil fuel extraction. So we're not in a good place for fossil fuel extraction. So there's been lots of environmental impacts, water contamination. There have been studies that have proven increase of birth defects in the communities where fracking is happening. So it's real, tangible, negative impacts on health and the environment. So when we talk about public acceptance, a lot of the discussion, allusion, or mention so far has really been this local opposition by the communities that are impacted, right? And that's what a lot of it sounds like the research in this project is about local impacts and trying to minimize and understand those. But there's also broader resistance to fossil fuel extraction at large, right? Because of the climate risk, which is a different risk than the local risk. So I think when we think about public acceptance and why people might be protesting shale gas exploration, it's not just the local opposition, but it's also this bigger question to society about whether or not and how much we want to be investing in fossil fuel infrastructure. So now I just have a few photographs of different protests. This is in Salem, Massachusetts, where a coal-fired power plant closed down. And there were some plans for renewable installation, but instead a natural gas power plant has just been put in. This is in Pennsylvania, where the drinking water has been contaminated. This is a protest or demonstrating the risks to the community with the water. This is the water, drinking water, I assume, and this is protest to ban fracking in Pennsylvania, which is a state that has been very heavily impacted. And we also have concerns not just of the extraction of natural gas, but the pipeline and pipeline safety. So this is the extensive network of natural gas pipelines in the United States. And there's calls for expanding those pipelines. And building natural gas pipeline infrastructure is very disruptive, and it locks us in for longer 40, 50 years assumption of continued natural gas flowing through these pipelines. So there's a lot of public opposition to pipelines, building new pipelines. And a lot of places do want to build new pipelines. And so that the pipeline protest for pipelines is another big issue. Just 2 weeks ago, in a community, three towns just an hour north of Boston, there were over 100 fires, 50 explosions in within this set of 3 towns, and it was a natural gas pipeline explosion. And they're still doing an investigation to figure out what happened. Only 1 person was killed, many injured, but literally it just all blew up all over the place, and it was very, very frightening. And they're doing an investigation. They think the pressure in the gas pipeline was too high, and so a lot of places got opened up in the pipeline infrastructure. So this is just another public risk perception issue with natural gas. So what I wanted to do here is just highlight, does everyone know what NIMBY stands for? Not in my backyard. So that's what a lot of public opposition to projects is NIMBY, not in my backyard. With natural gas, we also have NUMBY, not under my backyard, right? People don't want the gas infrastructure going under where they live. And in the United States, we also have a lot of banana, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. Which speaks to the fact that, especially in a country like the United States, where there's a lot of land, people are used to spreading out, and people don't want infrastructure of any kind near them. So these are just phenomenon kind of understanding that local opposition. But I also want to point out this broader resistance to fossil fuel extraction. And as I was talking at lunch with some of the students, are very aware that to limit climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says if we want to limit to less than 2 degrees C, and even that is controversial. Some are saying it should be less than 1.5 degrees C if we don't want complete chaos in the world. We need to drastic reductions in fossil fuel reliance. There's no way around it. And really that means leaving some fossil fuels in the ground. And so, for this audience, the question is that feasible, right? And most people, many energy experts say, we'll never do that because it's free and we have the infrastructure. I mean, not free. It's cheap, and that's never going to happen. But I guess the question is, the science is telling us that we need to do something beyond just reducing emissions, but actual drastic reductions if we don't want real chaos. And so this is a fundamental question that I think is worth considering. So before ending, I just wanted to give a sense of some of the specific work that I've been working on in this space. And I want to introduce 2 concepts. Energy democracy is one, and embodied energy injustice is another. And both of these, I have papers on if anyone's interested to find out more about them. So energy democracy is all about redistributing power through the renewable energy transformation. And it's the idea that communities and regions of the world, throughout the world, could have a vision of locally appropriate mix of renewable energy. And it's moving away from fossil fuels. And it's a growing social movement. It's really about participatory, collective action, and embraces having diversity in energy decision-making. And it's actually quite intentionally acknowledging the power of the corporate fossil fuel energy companies. And it's resisting that, resisting the corporate control of energy. So it's really in response to growing inequities, racial and socioeconomic inequities, unequal distribution of the impacts and the benefits of energy, our current energy system. Some people are profiting immensely over our fossil fuel infrastructure, and other people are really vulnerable because of our fossil fuel infrastructure. And the political power of the fossil fuel industry is a big concern. And I know there are representatives of the fossil fuel industry here today, and I don't mean to be negative on everybody, but we know that some of the big companies like ExxonMobil and Shell have very intentionally invested in resisting the renewable energy transformation, and they have been intentionally misinforming for decades a campaign about climate science, which in the United States at least, and I think it's similar here, maybe not as bad, literally where half the country thinks that climate change is not a problem. I mean, that's not, maybe not half, but a lot of people don't believe that climate change is a problem, which is just hard to fathom. But it's because of an intentional strategy by fossil fuel industry representatives to fund and support misinformation campaigns to teach people that it's not a problem, so that they can keep perpetuating their profit-seeking perspective. So energy democracy is about resisting that. It's about resisting the dominant energy agenda and keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and reclaiming the energy sector by democratizing it and giving local control and more public and community control rather than corporate control. And it's about restructuring so that energy is thought of as a public good and communities will own their own energy. And so this is, as I mentioned, a growing social movement, and it's kind of similar to the local food movement, in that people see the power and the jobs and the economic benefits for them by democratizing the energy systems, which will only happen if we do a transformation toward clean energy. So the antithesis of energy democracy is energy dominance, which is the US national level policy right now on energy. It is about maximizing extraction of fossil fuels to have power over others. That's what dominance means. And it's very explicitly, what do you notice about this photograph? All white men, right?
Old white men.
Old white men, yeah. It's very intentionally projecting and embodying a certain kind of power. And it is nationalistic, very much focused on fossil fuels, masculinist, patriarchal, oligarchy. And this orientation has also had and this administration has aggressive attacks on any individuals who are focused on the social justice aspects of energy. And as you may have been reading about, there's all kinds of abuses of power and challenges to our democracy that are connected and intersected with our energy policy. So I really think energy democracy is almost they're kind of like two poles. Energy democracy on one side, energy dominance on the other. And one is future-oriented, the other is nostalgic, kind of trying to bring things back to some mythical past that some people have fond memories of, I guess. One is focused on community control and the public good. The other is very centralized control and benefits only to a very, very few at the top. So it's a really very different orientation. So that's the energy democracy idea. I then also just want to briefly introduce this notion of embodied energy injustice. And this is a project that I've been working on with some colleagues who we've been studying fossil fuel extraction and fossil fuel consumption. And one of the things that we realize is that a lot of the decisions about fossil fuels get made at the community level, and they don't necessarily integrate the injustices that are associated with the extraction that are often at another place. So coal mining is often very distant from the places where people actually rely on the coal. and similarly with natural gas and fracking in the United States, a lot of the fracking is happening in Pennsylvania and specific parts of the country, but the benefits, people are deciding to use the natural gas in other parts of the country, and they're unaware of the negative impacts. So it's the whole idea of they're hidden, distant, transboundary injustices associated with the extraction of fossil fuels. And extraction, processing, and also in transport and disposal, there also are negative impacts that the communities that are benefiting from using the fuels don't necessarily think about. So we've been introduced this idea to provide a framework to explicitly consider the full life cycle of fossil fuel processes, extraction, processing, transport, and combustion and disposal. So I will end there and happy to have some discussion about all this. But I would say that I often put up this figure, this photograph, which just is supposed to represent that the landscape is changing, and if we play by the same rules, it's not going to end well, right? If you try to play soccer on this field, it won't really work. So the point here is that we need to change the rules because the world has changed from beneath us from what it used to be. And so climate disruptions are intensifying, much more frequent, and there's a big societal cost of continuing to burn fossil fuels that is not generally recognized. The fossil fuel industry, many companies continue to resist climate mitigation so that they can sustain their profits. It's actually impossible. They've tried carbon capture and storage and other mechanisms to try to figure out maybe there's a way we can still burn fossil fuels and mitigate climate change. But really, it's kind of fundamentally impossible because it's a paradox. You can't really do both. So the fossil fuel industry continues with their strategic misinformation campaign about climate risks. And I don't know how it is here, but in the United States, the fossil fuel industry has had a huge influence on our national politics. And it's nobody trusts the government anymore, and nobody trusts the industry. So there's big mistrust, and it's very sad because people don't feel like either the government or the industry has people, the community's best interest at heart. So the final question I would ask is, how can we keep fossil fuels in the ground? And I understand many of you are studying the details of fossil fuel extraction. So this is a question that probably maybe makes you feel uncomfortable. But if we think about climate change and we think about the broader future, it's a question that we all need to be asking ourselves. So I think that is all that I have. Yeah.
Perfect. Mission accomplished. That was a stimulating discussion. Please, the floor is open for questions. Students, please don't be shy. These are exactly the topics that we want to address in the MSc. Thanks.
Is this turned on? Okay, perfect. So I would like to address the renewable energy matter. I'm pretty sure that, first of all, I'm aware that there are certain cities around the world, especially in Germany, that have decentralized energy production through renewables. So their entire cities powered 100% through renewable sources of energy. The thing is that I'm not sure if this is achievable at this time with the technology we have for a larger scale, like cities like London or New York. I don't think we have the technology to store all this energy, because with renewables, one day you have the wind and the sun, another day you don't. So the days that you have more energy than you need, you have to store it. And for large cities, I'm pretty sure that we don't have the technology to store all this energy. Now, I would also like to address the energy monopoly, monopoly thing. Large companies like E.ON have made the turn and they have coexisted with renewable sources of energy, and they have invested in the renewable sector, although they were officially depended on coal and other fossil fuels. So I'm not sure if we have still a monopoly in this energy sector. For me, the solution should be stricter safety and environmental regulations, and a coexistence, a synergistic existence between renewables and cleaner fossil fuels like gas, until we have the technology to be fully dependent on renewables.
Okay. Yeah, so your perspective is very widely held by a lot of people. And there's work by Mark Jacobson at Stanford University that has modeled 100% renewables for every state in the United States. And the technical feasibility argument is not actually that strong, because it's more of a political will. If we want to do it, you can have a heterogeneous mix of renewables. There is storage technology. You could have offshore wind mixed with large-scale solar. I mean, there are ways that you could, with a smart grid that can integrate lots of different renewable technologies, including hydro and geothermal, which is, you can have almost very steady. Geothermal energy is very steady. So if you mix all the technologies together, there are ways. I mean, technically, it is feasible, I think, I guess is my one argument. But the challenge is in what people think is politically feasible. Like, how much can we change our assumptions and our institutions and our regulations and our economic subsidies for all kinds of all of these technologies. And that's where I think in my view, it's a political feasibility, not a technical feasibility challenge. You mentioned some other things, but I don't know if there was a direct question with your other comments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Adriel from University College London. I have a question about, I guess, renewables and fossil fuels being substitutes, because I think a lot of the resistance now is coming from the fact that with fossil fuels, there is that potential of striking oil and getting a lot of revenue compared to the cost that you put in. Whereas renewables, it's more like bond-like returns compared to your investment in that technology. What do you think renewable energy can offer that is more tangible than just, saving the planet, that can shift shift the understanding of political bodies and the public in general?
There are more jobs in renewable energy, new jobs in renewable energy. There's many people making a lot of money on renewable energy. So, I mean, it has a long-term horizon. Fossil fuels is very much boom and bust. Even the natural gas boom in the United States, there was, for a year or two, some communities were all thinking this is great, and then it went down. And then they're left with, the negative impacts without long-term anything positive. So I think the long-term, a lot of financial decisions, if you're able to have the long-term vision, I think there's a lot more stability in renewables than in the boom and bust cycles of fossil fuels.
Let me ask to Gary. Do you think the process that has been implemented in England can be extended to other areas in the European community?
Yes, I think it potentially could. We have been doing quite a lot of work as Impel projects. Impel stands for the implementation of European environmental law, and every year the European Commission takes bids, which, if they're good enough, they approve. They're relatively small projects, but it does mean then that many European countries can feed into that and share ideas. So we have been the project manager of these projects. We've done one a year from 2015 through and including this year, and I'm just completing this year's report now, and we've found them very helpful. And all I can say, Alberto, is that there's been a tremendous amount of input and engagement from other European countries. We do have to accept the fact that some European countries have decided for their own political reasons, and that's fair enough, they've decided not to have shale gas. They've implemented a moratorium, and that, of course, is their political prerogative to do so. But those countries that do have an onshore oil and gas program and are looking at not just the opportunities, but also whether it is sensible to go ahead with shale gas. I think are getting quite a lot out of these miniature projects that we're doing. I say small because they're small compared to like the ShaleXT, for example, and they only run within the year. They have to be completed within the year. So I think that because there is a lot of the legislation goes across Europe, things like the Water Framework Directive, the Mining Waste Directive, the Industrial Emissions Directive, all of those directives are common throughout Europe. How individual member states implement them into their own domestic legislation varies, but the basic directive behind it is the same. So there is the same common platform, and I think there is a very good opportunity there that other countries could adopt those methods, and we would be more than happy to, in fact we are working with other European countries to share those ideas and report on the success. The only thing is, at the moment, in terms of shale, as you probably know, that after the events in 2011 at Priest Hall, there hasn't been any hydraulic fracturing in the UK. Scotland has got a moratorium. Welsh Government has called in the decision, so it's all a moratorium in all but by name. And in England, we are hopefully, there should be a resumption of hydraulic fracturing within the next month or two, but that depends obviously on the decision of the operator, Codrilla.
If I can follow up a little bit, thanks to start with. In the designing of the process that you described today, did you take into consideration best practices from outside of Europe, for example, North America or somewhere else? Was that useful, helpful?
Yes, we've had a lot of engagement. We've had a great deal of help and generosity from other countries outside of Europe. I personally have benefited from spending quite a lot of time out in Alberta as a guest of the Alberta Energy Regulator and learning from what they do, including going out on site and carrying out audits of actual oil and gas installations. And colleagues of mine have been to several colleagues have been to the US. We've generally been very impressed with the regulatory work that they are doing. In the US, it is very much state by state, so there'll be some variance there. But we've been overwhelmed actually by the help and support that we've had from other countries. Yeah, it's been good.
Adrian Gregory from Moore Consultancy. This question for Gary. Who's actually responsible for reservoir integrity? Because obviously with the Upper Boland Shale being fracked, I mean, fracks go out of zone occasionally, so who's actually responsible?
In what aspect do you mean, Adrian, in reservoir integrity? Do you mean the risk to groundwater?
Well, really, if you're fracking within, say, the Boland Shale, what happens if you frack out of that zone?
Well,
who's responsible for that?
The permit doesn't allow that. The operator has to demonstrate that they're going to stay within the target horizon, and they have a permit boundary which they have to maintain. So we would expect them, if from the microseismic monitoring that they're carrying out, they look like they're getting near to that boundary, the permit agreement requires them to actually stop their activities and review the pressures that they're using and the fluid volumes so that they don't frack outside of it.
But obviously that's happening in real time, so So there's no traffic light system for that. That's my question.
Well, the traffic light system applies to the seismicity in terms of generated seismic events. I think the question that you've asked me relates to the propagation, in terms of distance or three-dimensional positioning of the fractures. Is that correct?
It's really the growth of the fracture.
Yeah.
They're making it.
So we, as part of the hydraulic fracturing plan, we get the operators to carry out a fault reactivation study. They have to use the existing seismic data to identify all known faults, and then they have to carry out fault reactivation study, which requires them to look at the actual stress regime at target depth, and to carry out the appropriate modelling to demonstrate which existing faults they think might be prone to reactivation. Obviously that's not a perfect science, and there will be other faults that don't show up on the data. But with the best will in the world, they're looking at high risk areas, and then they actually design their frac stages to avoid the worst of those risky areas. And as I say, if they look like they're getting near to the boundary, then they have to, in real time, then they actually have to stop pumping and curtail their operations.
One other question, Quadrilla are also saying they're going to do 40 fracs per well. So that's really like subsurface mining rather than conventional well technology with a few fracs. Would you consider it different if it was mining to well technology?
I'm not quite sure of the environmental aspect of that question. I mean, it's hard to imagine that sort of mining, but where mining is carried out, and we have a number of very high-profile, potentially strategic mining activities in the UK that are either happening now or in line to happen very soon. Both up in the northeast and down in the southwest for the hard rock metals. The regulations that we have in terms of requirement under the Water Framework Directive to identify groundwater activities and carry out a full risk appraisal of that in order to make sure that any potential impacts are correctly mitigated, is a commonality between hydraulic fracturing and mining. And of course, any wastes that are produced, there's the Mining Waste Directive, which applies not only to mineral mining, hard rock metal mining, and also the oil and gas industry. So the regulatory tools might be applied slightly different in terms of the practicalities, but the actual legislation has the same effect of protecting the environment in each case.
Hi, my name is Umair Tariq. I'm from Kappa Engineering. I know the topic of environment is quite political, so I'll try to keep my question as apolitical as possible. And it's more of a comment, but I would like your opinion on it. There's a very persistent complaint from, let's say, the developing world, that the developed world have built their economies, built their industry on the back of cheap coal, fossil fuels. So the climate change that we see today is in fact the fault of those developed countries that have polluted the environment, polluted the waters. And now when the developing countries or the developing world starts to exploit those resources, you're saying you shouldn't, and you should invest in expensive technologies to meet your energy needs. So when it comes to energy democracy, what you talked about, so where does the developing world get its funding? Where does the developing world get its investment? And many big companies, BP as an example, have been rebranding themselves as energy companies as opposed to oil companies or gas companies as they were previously branded. So at the end of the day, the investment is still going to come from big conglomerates, which means the dominance will stay. So it will not be democratized as one would hope, because the investment has to come from somewhere. So I would just like to know your opinion on that. And secondly, when you say that it has to be decentralized energy generation, what, in your opinion, is the size of a community? I mean, is it a city, a town? Because if it's a remote village, it's a remote mountain village, the location of the village itself might not allow for any energy generation there. So which means they have to team up with a nearby village or a nearby community. And then the question comes again, what about democracy? What if the energy needs of that community have to, in order to fulfill the energy needs of that community, you have to make decisions that are adverse to the social, environmental. So, what is a community in your opinion?
Yeah, great.
I'm assuming this question is for Gary.
So to your first point, excellent point about, the countries that have contributed the most to climate change so far are not the countries that are most vulnerable, although there's vulnerabilities in many countries, and countries that have not yet used their fossil fuel resources, have a right, feel a right to use. And of course, that makes a lot of sense. The opportunity, I think, is that if there's a way, I don't know what the magic bullet in terms of financing is, but if there's a commitment and a way to get those initial investments, the fossil fuel trajectory doesn't have to take place in the same way that it has in the past, right? And you can leapfrog over some of that dirty technology that results also in negative health impacts in the extraction and working conditions for people who are working in the industry. So there are a lot of other benefits if that initial investment can come. And I don't have the perfect answer on how that initial investment can come, but there are people working on that. And there are big companies that are, recognize the possibilities for profiting in that space, as well as the companies and the organizations that can profit in the fossil fuel space. So I think that's one piece of the response to that. In terms of the size of the community and the distributed versus centralized, there's a tension there, because to ramp up renewables quickly, you do need large-scale renewables, right? We need huge wind farms and solar arrays, and if we really are thinking about ramping up so in my view, I think there's a mix, again, with scale, of some lots of large-scale renewable installations, coupled with local household level, community level, and community at multiple scales. Even having a state or a region have a lot of renewables gives a lot of internal authority to that region. But it's scalable. So at whatever scale you want to say the community, including just a household or a few households, if they have their own source of renewable perpetual power, it's a freedom, and it's a lowering of their fuel bill for the future, right? So it's a benefit, it's an opportunity. But you obviously, as you pointed out, you need that initial investment, and that's what's difficult. Yeah.
I think John is next, but then I want one of the students to ask another question.
Joanna and Michael.
All right, but before Michael, I want one of the students, so get ready.
Jennifer Walker, UCL. Gary, we've seen in other parts of the energy sector that there are regulations and there are systems in place, and yet accidents still happen. The risks are still there. Off the record, or in your own opinion, where do you think are the weaknesses in the UK regulations, or where would you be concerned that there is a loophole where an accident could happen?
That's a really good question. I think that you can never be 100% in anything. I would agree with that. I think that you have to do the best that you can do, and you have to do that with a good heart, really. And if you have looked at every potential risk that you can identify, and made sure that you've ensured that the operator obviously has a responsibility of ensuring that and demonstrating that they can put in place the correct mitigations to prevent that. And if you've done that to the best of your ability, then I think that after that it becomes more or less a political decision about what risks are going to be taken. After all, you know, there are all sorts of things that we face, and just on a daily basis, just driving along the road is a risk. Nobody says that driving a car is 100% safe. Therefore, because it's not 100% safe, we'll just recycle all our cars and walk everywhere. So I know I don't wish to belittle it, but I think that nearly everything that we do, there's a very small risk. It's about reducing that risk to a level which is socially acceptable. And that's where the social debate has to come in. The benefits that we have from fossil fuels, you know, in this case shale gas in terms of heating and also industrial feedstock, and the benefits to the economy. And you have to look at those benefits to society, even if they are a bridge fuel, and that you're looking to maybe invest money from that into development of more renewables or whatever. You have to look at it and say, how is it benefiting society? What are the downsides to society? And as I say, I think that then, with respect, it moves slightly away from the Environment Agency's view on it, and it becomes more of a social debate that government needs to consider at that level. Our job is to be what I describe as a yes-if regulator. In other words, yes, you can carry out that activity if you can successfully demonstrate that you have covered off all the risks and that you are not going to cause environmental harm.
Mike Wilkins, Colorado State. I just had two quick questions. I guess the first one's probably to Gary. It's been many years since I've lived here in the UK. And so I was just wondering, in terms of long-term support here for hydraulic fracturing, does support for shale gas span sort of the UK political spectrum? Or sort of in the future, might there be some sort of greater control over shale gas extraction? Are you aware of how sort of wide that support is here in the UK?
I think you've got to look at the planning system at the moment, because permissions for shale gas activities to go ahead relies on having a planning consent, and I think that's where that debate comes in. From the point of view of the regulators that I've been talking of today, the HSE will clearly authorise anything that, or rather the HSE don't authorise. The operators have to demonstrate to the HSE that they are compliant. But the OGA and ourselves who offer consents of one form or another, be it a pedal licence or in our case an environmental permit, have to be satisfied that the activity can go ahead in accordance with the domestic legislation and European directives that apply to those activities. In terms of the question that you're asking, I think that goes beyond that, and that goes into the community then, and that probably comes under planning. And I think you have to look at it, and it's gone both ways in terms of planning consent. Sometimes it's been turned down and then it's been overturned on appeal, and there's this very much this knife edge of will it, won't it be approved at that local level. And I think that's where your question sits really. But as I'm not a planner, I can't answer that for you, I'm sorry.
Jenny, I had one quick question for you as well. So you had a phrase at the start of your presentation that I see quite a lot, bridge fuel. Is that a real thing, or is that sort of a term that's been dreamt up in Washington by special interests? What's your opinion on that?
Well, it's been used as a way to conceptualize this transformation and still using fossil fuels. And it was also used quite a bit, has used quite a bit, not just bridge fuel, but bridge technology in carbon capture and storage, which I've done a lot of work on as well. And so it's a way to reconcile these kind of, and think temporally, right? But then the question is, is it, how much do you want to invest in the bridge versus trying to accelerate to get to the other side? So it's just a way to conceptualize it. I think And it is definitely used as a positive way to reconcile some of the tensions that I brought up. So I think different people use it in different ways. Some people are quite critical of that term. So I've heard people say a bridge to nowhere or a bridge to like chaos, you know, so yeah, it's a good question to raise. So that's why I brought it up. Yeah.
Well, there is one. Can we take one more question from a student?
Hiya, yeah, I'm Toby from UCL. My question is for Jenny. So part of your talk, or quite a lot of your talk, was about the social justice side of things and about how there's potentially underrepresentation of minorities and women in the oil and gas industry. I just wanted your opinion on why that might be, whether it's a case of there's not enough encouragement for minorities and women to do the right qualifications in order to get the jobs, or whether it's because companies just aren't hiring women and minorities like they should be. And then the second part to that was, is there any data to suggest that the renewable industry is doing it differently and hiring more minorities and women? And if so, when this big renewable boom happens, will there be more minorities and women in CEO and leadership roles?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it is kind of cultural assumptions that are made, both in education and in the industry, that just kind of sort people in ways that end up with not a very diverse workforce in the energy sector. So there are mechanisms, in education, trying to diversify and have better access to education in the energy space. And I actually spend a lot of time thinking about energy education, right? Energy doesn't easily fit in our traditional disciplines in the university. So there's increasingly energy studies kind of emerging as a minor in some universities, as a kind of cross-cutting interdisciplinary area of study that isn't a particular discipline. So that's one thing that helps to broaden who even thinks to go into energy and study energy. And then when you think about women in leadership is actually another level, and that's beyond energy, and that is a broader conversation with all kinds of factors that are contributing to, because that you can see across the board in all kinds of private sector. We've actually, in some places, it's been going down, the women's representation on boards. And even though the case is made financially that if you have more women in your board, your company will actually do better. And diversity of all kinds, not just gender diversity. So it's very difficult, and a lot of it is cultural. And I don't know how much any of you have been paying attention to the news in the United States. We have a very difficult, hostile, misogynistic president that perpetuates and then gives men license to treat women really badly. And that is a negative that has broad impacts, including how women show up in the workforce. So it's a bigger systemic problem. We did look a little bit at the renewable sector to see if there's more representation. And there's some really innovative things going on in the renewable sector, trying to train low-income or disadvantaged communities in renewable jobs, and also opening up training opportunities for women to get into the renewable sector. So I don't think it's a big success story, but there's lots of opportunities and people recognizing these new jobs are emerging that can be distributed all around the country. So there's a lot of possibilities there. Yeah.
And that same sort of scheme isn't happening in the oil and gas industry?
Not in the same way, no. Yeah.
Well, I hate to cut this conversation that is very helpful, but we are running out of time. So please join me in thanking our speakers. And I leave the podium to Adrian, who is going to close the session.
Thank you, everybody, for attending. As you travel home, you might like to reflect that you all have a choice on where your electricity comes from. You could look at the providers, the demographics of where they are obliged to say where their power is sourced. and you all can make a choice. So if you are riding a bicycle, thumbs up. John? If you are taking the tube, not so bad. If you're driving a car, bad, etc. So personal choices ultimately will have a big influence over your futures. And whether that's in your philosophy or in your practice, you have a choice. Anyway, thank you everybody for today. Thanks to all the speakers who were excellent. Thank you to the chairs who helped organize. Thank you especially to the Deep Carbon Observatory who funded this. To the European Commission for all the support for the SXT, on which this is the platform, and to the Geological Society for hosting us, audience, participants and students. Thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.
Yeah.